Imagine this. Two exhausted coal miners, faces black with dust, lungs burning, stand on opposite sides of a roaring union hall. In less than 24 hours, one of them will step onto the path to become Prime Minister of Australia. The other will swear he'll stop him, whatever it takes. They are not polished politicians yet. They are men who still carry the smell of coal and sweat, men whose hands shake when they light their pipes after a shift underground. One is Joseph Cook. The other, his rival, louder, angrier, certain the world must change by force, stares at him across the room like a challenge. The clock is ticking, not just toward an election, but toward a lifetime of rivalry that will follow Joseph Cook from the pits of England to the parliament of a new nation. But before the speeches, before the votes, before the headlines, there was a boy standing at the edge of a mine shaft, listening to the earth breathe. Joseph Cook was born on 7 December 1860 in Silverdale, a small mining village in Staffordshire, England. Silverdale was not the kind of place that appears on postcards. It was a place of chimneys and slag heaps, where the sky was often the color of the coal dust that hung in the air. Houses huddled together like they were bracing against the wind. Voices carried thinly across the valley. Women calling children in from the street, the distant clanking from the colliery, the hoarse shout when something went wrong underground. His father, also named Joseph, went down the mine every day before the sun rose. He came back bent and tired, hands nicked with fresh cuts, coughing as if his lungs were made of gravel instead of flesh. For young Joe, the mine was not some faraway monster. It was the thing that fed them and the thing that threatened to swallow them whole every single day. Then, when Joe was still a child, the mine took his father and did not give him back. The details were simple and brutal, as they so often were. An accident underground. A collapse. A body brought up wrapped in a rough cloth, laid out on a table that usually held bread and simple meals. In the dim light of a single lamp, Joe watched his mother's hands tremble as she reached for the still face of her husband. She did not scream. She pressed her lips together as if she were trying to keep grief from spilling out and drowning the children. From that moment, the clock started ticking for Joe. Childhood, as other people knew it, was over. He left school around the age of 9. There would be no leisurely afternoons with books and lessons, no safe classrooms smelling of chalk. Instead, there was the cold, damp mouth of the mine. The first time he stepped into the cage that carried men down into the dark, he felt the world fall away above him. The light shrank to a distant circle, then vanished, replaced by the hard glow of lamps on helmets and the eerie, close air of the underground tunnels. He became a pit boy, a child in a world of men. He learned how to move quickly, ducking low beams and sliding between carts. He learned the language of the mine, the knocking sounds that meant danger, the sudden silence that meant something was wrong, the sharp, panicked shouts that made every heart stop. He learned that boys could die just as easily as men, and that the colliery would keep running no matter who was missing. But in that darkness, something unusual happened. While others accepted that the mine was all they would ever know, Joe began to look, really look, at the men around him. He watched their faces when they were told their wages. He listened when they whispered about the owners, about how profits rose while their pay barely moved. He saw the way they flinched at the names of men buried alive in roof falls that could have been prevented. And then, in the evenings, he would climb out of that black world and walk to a place glowing with a different kind of light. The primitive Methodist chapel in Silverdale was small and plain, but to Joe it felt like another country. Here, men who cursed underground now spoke with careful intensity, reading from the Bible, singing hymns that rose like something, lighter than the coal dust they carried home. Joe listened, wide-eyed, as preachers talked about justice, about the worth of every soul, about how the meek might not stay meek forever. He did not just absorb their words, he watched their delivery, how they held themselves, how they paused before a key phrase, how their voices lifted and fell, drawing the congregation in. Without realizing it, the boy from the mines was studying the art of speaking to a crowd. One evening, a preacher did something that would echo through Joe's entire life. He spoke not just of heaven, but of earth. Not just of souls, but of wages and work, and the duty of Christians to fight for fair treatment. He said that God did not delight in men being crushed in the mines so that others could grow rich. He hinted, carefully but clearly, that it was not enough to simply endure suffering. Perhaps sometimes it must be challenged. The words hit Joe like a shock. In that cramped chapel, with the smell of damp coats and coal smoke, he felt a door open in his mind. If faith could demand justice, then maybe the world was not fixed. Maybe the future was not written in coal dust and pain. Yet Silverdale, for all its revelations, still tightened around him like a noose. The wages were low. The work was brutal. The path seemed to run in one direction. Boy, miner, coughing man, early grave. Rumors drifted into the village like smoke. Stories of new lands, of ships leaving for places where the sun burned hotter and the mines, they said, were different. Australia. The word itself sounded exotic, absurd, almost imaginary. But in the spring of 1885, a letter reached the village. A man who had left before them wrote back, describing opportunities in the colonies, work in the coal fields of New South Wales, and the chance, just the chance, for something more than survival. Joe stared at that letter until the ink blurred. The thought of leaving everything he knew, of stepping onto a ship and sailing to a country he could barely picture, filled him with dread. But the thought of staying, of ending up like the men who coughed themselves to sleep every night, that was worse. There was another reason, too, though Joe spoke of it less often. In Silverdale, he had begun to stand up in the chapel as a lay preacher, his voice awkward at first, then steadier. He had spoken, tentatively, about injustice. A few of the older men in the village, men with power, men with connections to the mine owners, had narrowed their eyes at him. One took him aside and told him, in a tone that was almost friendly, that a young man could make things very difficult for himself by asking the wrong questions too loudly. The message was clear. Stay in your place. The decision came with a brutal simplicity. A ship would leave in a matter of days. Tickets were being bought by men who were tired of swallowing coal for a living. If Joe wanted to go, he had to move now. There would be no second chance. No leisurely weighing of options. The dock would not wait for him. He argued with himself through sleepless nights. His mother needed him. His brothers and sisters would miss him. But he looked at her hands, raw from work, and at the empty space where his father should have been, and he understood that staying might only mean one more body on that table, one more funeral. On a cold, gray morning, with the wind cutting through his thin coat, Joseph Cook stepped onto a ship bound for Australia. As the shoreline of England receded, he stood at the rail and gripped it until his knuckles were white. The sea stretched out before him like an impossibly long sentence. Behind him, Silverdale shrank to a memory. Ahead, an unknown world waited, indifferent to whether he succeeded or failed. Weeks later, when he finally glimpsed the coastline of New South Wales, the air felt wrong. It was hotter, drier. The light was harsher, too bright after the muted tones of England. The sky seemed bigger, more brutally honest about how small a man really was. He made his way to Lithgow, a town carved out between mountains, where the coal seams cut through the earth like scars. The mines there swallowed men just as easily as Silverdale's, but the faces were different, the accents mixed, Irish, English, Scottish, Australian-born. The promise of opportunity tasted like dust, but it was there, faintly, if you believed in it. Joe went down the pits again. The darkness was familiar, almost comforting, but this time, he was not just another boy. He was a young man with the memory of sermons still burning in his chest, and with a strange, stubborn hope that crossing the world had to mean more than exchanging one set of chains for another. He began to speak again. At first it was in the change rooms, casual remarks about safety, about wages, about the way the owners treated the men like an expendable part of the machinery. Then, in union meetings, his voice grew more confident. He spoke as someone who understood not just the suffering, but the pattern behind it. He invoked not just anger, but morality, saying that no man should be asked to risk his life for so little, that families should not live one accident away from starvation. One evening, in a cramped hall lit by smoky lamps, Joe stood up to address a meeting of miners. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Men leaned forward, their faces harsh and skeptical. They had heard promises before. Joe's heart hammered in his chest. This was not a chapel. There was no hymn to hide behind, no preacher to rescue him if he faltered. He spoke anyway. He talked about Silverdale, about the body on the table, about the way his mother's shoulders had bent under grief and necessity. He pictured the men in front of him lying cold and still, their children staring in shock, and let that image shape his words. He talked not in abstract terms of rights and conditions, but in the language of food on the table, boots on children's feet, wives who did not have to send their sons down the mine at 9. When he finished, there was silence. Then, slowly, men began to nod. A few clapped. It was not thunderous, not yet, but it was real. In that crowd, another man watched him closely. He was broad-shouldered, with a voice like a hammer striking steel. He'd come up through the same tunnels, breathing the same dust, but where Joe's speeches mixed faith and reform, this man spoke the language of confrontation. His name would not be carved in history with the same force as Joe's, but at that moment, in that hall, he mattered. He saw in Joe not just an ally, but a potential rival. They both wanted change. They just disagreed on how far and how fast and who should lead the charge. Their clashes began quietly. A sharp word in a meeting, a disagreement about emotion, a difference in tactics. But each confrontation left a mark. Joe would argue that they had to be practical, that raging against the owners without a plan would get them nothing but broken strikes and blacklisted men. His rival would fire back that moderation had never broken a chain. Their disagreements didn't stay in the hall. Men at the pit head whispered about them, choosing sides. One said Joe had the brains, the other said the rival had the guts. Both, they agreed, had their eyes on something beyond the mine: politics. The word hovered over Lithgow like the haze of smoke from the furnaces. Across the colonies, the labor movement was stirring. Men who had once only cursed conditions now organized, formed unions, plotted to send their own kind into Parliament. Why plead with distant gentlemen when you could put a coal miner in the chamber itself? It was a radical thought, and a dangerous one. In 1891, the pressure that had been building for years finally broke the surface. The new Labour Electoral League wanted candidates, working men prepared to stand for the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. The seat of Hartley, which included the Lithgow district, suddenly mattered in a way it never had before. Joe, the preacher from the pits, found his name whispered in corners as a possible candidate. So did his rivals. The clock started again. There were deadlines now. Dates for nominations, dates for meetings, dates for votes. The comfortable rhythm of shifts underground and evenings at home shattered. Every day, in addition to the aching muscles and the coal dust, there were conversations to have, alliances to forge, speeches to shape. Every hour spent catching up on sleep felt like a stolen luxury he could no longer afford. Joe knew what it meant to run. This would not just be a contest for a seat. It would be a test of whether a man like him could step out of the darkness for good. He would be pitted not just against the mine owner's preferred candidates, but against someone who knew him, who shared his background and his anger, who believed Joe was too cautious to lead. The Union Hall transformed into a battleground. Men who had once joked together now argued in public. Posters appeared. Names were shouted, cheered, booed. The labor movement, still young and raw, was learning how brutal democracy could be. There was another complication, one that would turn this contest from a simple rivalry into a moral crisis. Labor demanded a pledge. It was a promise, written in clear terms, that labor members would follow the decisions of the party. No freelancing, No conscience votes against the agreed platform. Unity was their weapon against wealthy opponents, and they meant to sharpen it. To many, that pledge was a badge of honor. To Joe, who had grown up in a chapel listening to men speak of conscience and responsibility before God, it felt like a chain. He believed in improving conditions for workers. He believed in giving men like those in Lithgow a voice, but he also believed, deeply, that no party, no committee, no movement had the right to own his judgment completely. He had not crossed an ocean to become someone else's obedient echo. His rival seized on that hesitation like blood in the water. At meeting after meeting, he framed the pledge as a test of loyalty. "If you're with the men," he thundered, "you sign. If you aren't prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder with your mates, if you think your own opinion matters more than the movement, then say so. Say it out loud. And step aside." Eyes turned to Joseph Cook. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. Men he'd worked alongside for years watched him, waiting to see if he would flinch. The party organizers reminded him, subtly and not so subtly, that without the pledge, without discipline, labor would fall apart and the old order would roll on unchallenged. He went home late one night, the draft pledge in his pocket, the ink faintly smudged from the sweat of his hand. On the small kitchen table, under the dim light of a lamp, he laid it out and read it again. His wife, Mary, who had watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and fear, sat opposite him, knitting set aside. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Joe stared at the words. He could almost hear his father's voice, coughing in that cramped house in Silverdale, saying any change was better than none. He could hear the preachers in the primitive Methodist chapel talking about conscience, about standing alone if you must. He could hear the roar of the Union Hall, the rivals' accusations, the whispers that Joseph Cook might not have the stomach for the fight. What he decided in that moment would shape not just his future in Hartley, not just his relationship with labor, but the course of his entire political life. Outside, the night in Lithgow was unnervingly still. Somewhere, a train whistle cut through the dark, long and lonely. The clock on the wall ticked, steady and relentless. The nomination deadline loomed, and with it, the end of the time he had left to hesitate. He picked up the pen. And in that silent kitchen in Lithgow, Joseph Cook did something that would shock almost every man who had cheered for him in the pits. He did not sign. He wrote his name on the nomination papers. Yes, he would stand for the seat of Hartley. He would ask the people to send a coal miner into Parliament. But when his eyes slipped back to the tight lines of the labor pledge, when he read again the words that demanded he bind his vote, his conscience, his voice to the will of the caucus, his hand froze. Mary watched him across the table, her fingers knotted together. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, a dog barked once and fell silent. Slowly, as if pushing against a weight, Joe set the pen down. He folded the pledge in half, then in half again, until it was a small, dense square in his palm. It felt heavier than paper ought to feel. "I can't," he said at last. Mary's eyes flicked to his. "Then they might turn on you." "I know." He could already hear his rival's voice, the booming certainty, the righteous anger. In the Union Hall, that man would wave the pledge in the air and ask why Joseph Cook, the minor preacher, was suddenly too good to stand with his mates. Was he already dreaming of a cushioned seat, of dinners with the very men who ran the mines? Joe imagined that accusation landing in the hearts of the men he'd worked alongside underground. Men who had trusted him. Men who had clapped for him when he spoke about justice. He closed his fist around the paper. If he signed, he told himself, he would never again be sure whether he was voting for what he believed or for what a meeting in some backroom had decided he must believe. He could not bear the idea of telling the miners of Hartley that his conscience belonged to a committee. The clock on the wall ticked on. The deadline for nominations approached. In 24 hours, his choice would either catapult him into a new world or strand him, exposed, between two furious camps. The next night, the Union Hall was overflowing. Miners lined the walls, arms folded, faces set. There were wives in their best shawls, children craning their necks to see over shoulders. The air smelled of wool, dust, and expectation. On the small platform at the front, two men stood facing the crowd. One was the rival whose speeches had echoed through Lithgow for months now, his knuckles white around the edge of the podium, the labor pledge spread before him like a banner. The other was Joseph Cook. The chairman cleared his throat. "We're here," he said, "to confirm our candidate for Hartley." The rival stepped forward first. He spoke of solidarity, of standing shoulder to shoulder, of breaking the old order by marching in lockstep. He held up the signed pledge, his signature bold and proud at the bottom. "This," he shouted over the roar of approval, "is what loyalty looks like." Then it was Joe's turn. He could feel the heat of the lamps on his face as he walked to the front. His heart hammered, but his voice, when it came, was steady, carved by years of sermons in cramped chapels and arguments in the change rooms. "I stand with you," he began. "I came here with coal dust still under my nails, just like you. I have buried friends from the pits, just like you. I have watched owners grow rich while your children went barefoot." Heads nodded. The room leaned in. "But," he said, and the word sliced the air in two, "I will not give my conscience away. Not to the owners and not to a caucus." A low murmur spread through the hall. Some faces hardened. Others watched him with a tense, doubtful respect. "If you send me to Parliament," Joe went on, "I will fight for you. But I must be free to vote as I judge right. Not as someone tells me, miles away, with no coal dust in his lungs and no children depending on his wages." His rival laughed harshly. "So you're better than us now, Joe? Too fine to stand with your mates? That's what the gentlemen say about themselves." The crowd's mood teetered. Joe could feel the seconds slipping away. This was the moment. Either they believed him, or they would crush him. "No," he said quietly, but clearly, "I'm not better. I'm just a man who has to answer one day for what he has done. I'll answer to you, and I'll answer to my maker. I won't answer to a piece of paper that tells me to shut my mouth when I know something is wrong." There was silence. Long, dangerous silence. Then, from the back, one of the oldest miners in the room, a man whose face looked carved from the rock itself, shouted, "Let him stand. At least we'll know he's speaking straight." It was not a roar, but it was enough. A sliver of support. A path, narrow and risky, opening in front of Joseph Cook. The labor officials were furious, but they were also practical. The movement was young, fragile. They needed candidates who could win, and in Hartley, the man who could win, pledge or no pledge, was Joseph Cook. Weeks later, when the votes were counted, the result shocked the men who had muttered that he was finished. Against the odds, against the whispering campaign that branded him unreliable, he was elected to the New South Wales Legislative Assembly for Hartley in 1891. A coal miner, son of a dead miner from an English village few in Sydney had ever heard of, now walked through the grand stone corridors of Parliament House. The first time he stepped inside, he felt almost dizzy. The floors were polished, gleaming. The ceilings soared overhead. Voices echoed, not in the tight, oppressive way sound bounced in mind tunnels, but in an airy, detached fashion. Men in dark suits moved in small clusters, pausing to exchange murmured comments, as if the decisions made here did not crash down on families with the force of a rockfall. Joe's boots clicked loudly on the stone. He felt every eye that glanced at his worn coat, his plain collar, the roughness in his accent. He knew some of them were thinking, "How long will this one last?" Inside the chamber, he sat on the labor benches, but at a slight angle, as if his body already understood what his mind had not yet fully admitted. He was not entirely one of them. At first, the tension stayed mostly beneath the surface. He worked, he spoke, he voted. He argued for better conditions, for fairer laws, for the men whose names he still remembered from the pits. When he rose to speak, other members listened, as much from curiosity about the coal miner turned politician as from agreement. But the pledge he had refused to sign hung over him like invisible chains he'd chosen to leave unlocked. Time did not soften the clash between his instinct for independence and labor's drive for iron discipline. It sharpened it. Vote by vote, speech by speech, the gap widened. When he declined to toe the party line on certain bills, the labor leadership's patience frayed. Behind closed doors, voices rose. Words like traitor and rat began to float through the corridors. The rival from the Union Hall, now rising quickly within the party machine, pushed hard. He wants it both ways, the rival told others. The glory of being a worker's champion, and the freedom to abandon them whenever it suits him. Joe felt the walls closing in. The same movement that had lifted him out of the pits now threatened to crush him for refusing to surrender entirely. The break, when it came, was not a single dramatic explosion, but a series of sharp cracks. First, he was formally censured. Then he was pushed further to the margins of party meetings. Finally, he walked out of a caucus gathering and did not return. A short time later, he crossed the floor of the chamber and sat with the Free Trade Party, men he had once denounced as defenders of privilege. The reaction outside was swift and brutal. In mining towns, his name was spat out like a curse. Posters and pamphlets branded him a renegade, a turncoat, the man who had sold out the working class for a chance at advancement. In Lithgow, some of the men who had applauded his first speeches refused to greet him in the street. The boy from Silverdale had known the feeling of being cold, hungry, exhausted. Now he learned a new kind of isolation, being hated as a symbol of betrayal. But there was another side to this twist, a quieter, more strategic one. Within the Free Trade Party, led by the sharp-tongued George Reed, Joe was no longer just one of many ambitious labor men. He was a prize, a sign that labor's grip was not absolute. Reed quickly saw in him a rare combination, working-class credibility and a mind that ran on argument, detail, and stubborn logic. Joe, for his part, studied Reed as he had once studied preachers in the primitive Methodist chapel. He watched how Reed sliced through opponents with witty asides, how he framed complex tariff debates in terms ordinary voters could grasp, how he turned the idea of free trade into something that sounded almost moral. Within a few years, Joseph Cook was no longer the outsider in the free trade ranks. He was a rising star. He took on the role of Postmaster General in Reed's New South Wales government, handling the arteries of communication that connected a vast, scattered colony. He wrestled with budgets and regulations instead of timber props and coal carts. His hands grew smoother. His clothes improved. Yet when he returned to places like Lithgow, he still recognized, and was painfully reminded of, the gap between the polished world of Parliament and the rough reality of the pits. Meanwhile, beyond the chamber walls, a bigger clock had started ticking. The colonies of Australia, still separate, still jealous of their own powers, were inching toward something unthinkable a decade earlier. Federation. The idea of a commonwealth, a single nation, was moving from pub arguments and newspaper editorials into formal conventions, debates, us in drafts of constitutions. Joe watched this process with the wary interest of a man who had already crossed one ocean in search of a better future. A united Australia would mean a new parliament, a new arena, a chance to shape the rules from the ground up. It would also mean that rivalries, political, personal, ideological, would be magnified on a continental scale. As the 1890s rolled on, depression and strikes battered the colonies. The great maritime and shearers' strikes left bitterness and fear on both sides of the class divide. Each confrontation seemed to burn away one more layer of polite pretense. Workers organized more fiercely. Employers dug in. Governments, often caught in the crossfire, wavered and cracked. For Joseph Cook, the stakes kept rising. He had chosen a side now. Not labor, but a liberal conservative camp that believed in free trade, fiscal discipline, and cautious reform, rather than revolution. Yet every time he walked past men in dusty work clothes, their eyes told him they had not forgiven him. In 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was born. Bells rang, flags flew, speeches soared about the dawn of a new nation. But for Joe, the day that seared itself into his memory was the one when he stood as a candidate for the first federal election. The seat was Parramatta, on the outskirts of Sydney, a place of orchards, workshops, and modest homes. It was not a mining electorate, but it was full of people who knew what it meant to work hard for not very much. He campaigned furiously, moving from hall to hall, street corner to street corner. His past was both weapon and wound. Opponents accused him of abandoning labor. He countered that he had refused to surrender his conscience. Supporters praised his rise from the pits. Critics muttered that he now rarely touched coal except in metaphors. Election night crackled with tension. The counting was slow, the margin tight. As the hours dragged on, Joe paced, remembering the mine cages dropping into darkness, the long wait when an accident happened underground, and families clustered at the pit head, straining for news. This, too, was a descent into uncertainty. When the final numbers came, he had won. Joseph Cook was now a member of the first federal parliament of Australia, and somewhere, in another part of this vast new nation, another former miner, another working-class autodidact, was also taking his seat. His name was Andrew Fisher. They had not grown up in the same streets, had not argued in the same union halls. Fisher came from the coal mines of Scotland, from the Queensland pits, and he had stayed with Labour, signing the pledge Joe had refused, embracing the discipline Joe had rejected. 2 men, 2 paths, 1 chamber. At first, their rivalry was not personal so much as structural. Cook on the side of the free traders and later the merged liberal forces, Fisher on the side of Labour, rising steadily through its ranks. They watched each other across the chamber with the wary calculation of men who recognized something of themselves in the other, and something they could not forgive. Federation politics was a shifting maze. Parties merged and split, alliances formed and dissolved. Coalitions were stitched together in back rooms, only to unravel on the floor of the House. Through it all, Joe climbed. He became deputy leader of the Free Trade Party under Reid, then served as Minister for Defense in Alfred Deakin's fusion government in 1909. The boy who had once watched rockfalls bury men now reshaped the machinery of national defense, thinking not just of individual lives, but of regiments, fleets, and the grim possibility that one day Australians might fight in a war not of their making. All the while, Andrew Fisher's star was rising on the Labour side. He became Prime Minister in 1908. Briefly, lost office, regained it in 1910 with a majority strong enough to push through reforms that reshaped the young nation. Pensions, maternity allowances, an expanded navy. Each new law chipped away at the old order, giving Labour voters reasons to believe that their faith in the pledge, in discipline, in solidarity, was paying off. For Joseph Cook, watching from the opposition benches, the rivalry with Fisher hardened into something close to obsession. Here was the life he might have lived if he had bent his neck to the caucus whip. Here was the proof that there was another route from the pits to power, one that did not require crossing the floor, being called a traitor, carrying the scar of that choice for the rest of your days. But Cook did not regret the path he had taken. He regretted only that he had not yet convinced enough Australians that his path, individual conscience, fiscal caution, skepticism, about sweeping promises, was the safer road. By 1913, the nation itself seemed to be split down the middle, torn between 2 visions with the precision of a coal seam cut cleanly through rock. The election that year would decide more than who held the keys to the Prime Minister's office. It would be a test of whether the young Commonwealth wanted more of Labour's ambitious programs or a pause, a tightening, a government that promised not so much transformation as restraint. For Cook, now leader of the Liberal Party after Deakin's retirement, the campaign was personal in a way no previous contest had been. His opponent was Andrew Fisher, not just across the aisle but across a lifetime of choices. 2 former miners, 2 migrants from the old world's coal fields, one from England, one from Scotland. Both self-educated, both tough, both shaped by underground darkness and hard, narrow lives. One had become the champion of labor, the other, the symbol of everything labor warned about when it whispered the word rat in union halls. The clock was brutal. There were only weeks to convince a weary nation to change direction. Cook crisscrossed the country by train, rattling through endless miles of scrub and farmland. He spoke in town halls where kerosene lamps flickered, and in city theaters blazing with electric light. In each place, he adjusted his words but not his core message. Responsible government, careful spending, a firm hand on the tiller. At night, exhausted, he slumped in narrow railway bunks, the rhythm of the tracks beating a steady reminder. Every hour of sleep was an hour lost in the race against Fisher. In one coastal town, a heckler shouted, "You left the workers behind, Joe!" We'll never forget it. He stopped, gripped the lectern so hard his knuckles blanched. "I never left them," he said, his voice raw. "I just refused to pretend that one party, one pledge, one set of leaders had all the answers. If that makes me unpopular, so be it. But look me in the eye and tell me you'd rather have a man who says yes because he has to than one who says no because he believes he must." Sometimes the room went cold. Sometimes it warmed. Election day turned the whole country into a kind of vast, sprawling union hall, every voter taking a turn at the table. The count was agonizingly close. Seat by seat, margin by margin, the numbers swung back and forth like a cage in a mine shaft. In some electorates, a handful of votes decided the outcome. Rumors flew. Labor had held here. Liberals had edged ahead there. Newspapers rushed out extra editions that were out of date almost as soon as the ink dried. When the final tally came, it was like the moment after a roof fall when the dust clears, and men realize, with stunned disbelief, that they are still alive. Joseph Cook and the Liberal Party had won. But the victory was not a sweeping, triumphant landslide. It was a knife-edge, razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives, just one seat. In the Senate, Labor still held the upper hand and could block much of what Cook tried to do. He had reached the summit he had been climbing toward since the day he refused to accept that a mine was the only future a boy from Silverdale could have. He was now Prime Minister of Australia. Yet he stood at the edge of that achievement and saw not a peaceful plateau, but a narrow, storm-battered ledge. Behind him stretched a lifetime of compromises and conflicts, of unions and pledges and accusations of betrayal. Ahead of him, unseen but already rumbling across Europe, was a war that would drag his new nation into its first great test of blood and endurance. And in the opposition benches, ready to pounce on every misstep, sat Andrew Fisher, the rival whose path had run in a twisted parallel to Joe's for decades. The man who had chosen solidarity where Joe had chosen conscience, and who believed, with equal conviction, that history would prove him right. The clock did not stop, just because Joseph Cook had finally reached the highest office in the land. If anything, it began to tick louder. Power, he discovered, did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing at the mouth of a tunnel with the roof already cracking and only a few timber props left in your hands. On the first morning he walked into the Prime Minister's office. Joseph Cook should, by any normal measure, have been at peace. The journey from the pits of Silverdale to this polished desk in Melbourne was so unlikely that, if it had been a sermon, his younger self would have doubted it. Instead, as he sat down, the first sound that filled his ears was not celebration. It was the clock. The slim majority that had carried him into office in 1913 was already ticking away, second by second. One seat, one misstep, one bad week in Parliament, and everything he had fought for could vanish. And beyond the walls of his office, beyond the tidy Federation buildings and the ordered lawns, something far worse than a hostile Senate was forming. Clouds over Europe, rumors of ultimatums, of armies that could be on the march before anyone in Australia even saw the headlines. He spread out his papers on the wide desk, but his eyes kept drifting to the red dispatch boxes that contained cables from London, from ambassadors, from admiralty men who spoke in the clipped language of looming danger. He had spent his life trying to escape the darkness of the mines. Now, as Prime Minister, he could feel a different kind of darkness edging closer. For months, Joseph Cook's days fell into a relentless rhythm. Morning, briefings, memoranda, guarded conversations about how far he could push his program with a Senate still dominated by labor. He wanted to pare back spending, to rein in what he saw as reckless promises, to assert the authority of a government that believed in restraint rather than constant expansion. Each bill he sent to the upper house, each attempt to shift direction, met the same response: rejection, delay, obstruction. Afternoon, strategy sessions, votes, negotiations so tight they felt like balancing coal on the edge of a shovel. He knew that if he tried to rule as if he held a landslide, his government would shatter. But if he moved too cautiously, he risked looking weak, handing Andrew Fisher and Labor the chance to paint him as a man who had finally reached the top only to choke at the sight of the view. Night. More papers, more cables, more reports from Europe. Sarajevo. Ultimatums. Mobilizations. The words grew uglier. The clock grew louder. Within his own party, some urged him to pick a fight he could not lose, force a double dissolution, send the country back to the polls, gamble that voters would punish labor for blocking him. It was a breathtakingly risky idea. If he lost, his tenure as prime minister might go down as a brief, embarrassing footnote. If he won, he might secure a working majority, and time to govern before the storm broke. In the end, he chose the gamble. He sent up a bill that he knew labor would reject. When they did, he seized the constitutional trigger and asked the governor-general to dissolve both houses. It was a move as bold as any speech he had ever given in a Union hall. The date was set, 5 of September 1914. He had weeks to persuade the nation that his fragile government deserved not just survival, but stronger power. Weeks to turn a one-seat hold on the House into something solid. And then the world exploded. In early August, as the campaign barely began, the cable came through that would tear through every calculation, every strategy, every talking point about tariffs and pensions and budgets. Britain was at war with Germany. In a chained empire, that meant Australia was at war, too. The news hit Melbourne like a shockwave. Crowds flooded the streets, cheering, singing, waving Union Jacks. Young men climbed onto lampposts, shouting promises to enlist. Newspapers rushed out giant headlines. The war felt far away and thrilling, like a story from a different age suddenly made real. For Joseph Cook, standing at the center of this eruption, the moment was both simple and devastatingly complex. He knew what he had to say. When the empire is at war, he declared, so is Australia. In public, his voice was firm, almost fierce. He promised an expeditionary force, ships, money. He pledged Australia's support without hesitation. In private, he read the military assessments late into the night, studying the scale of the commitment he had just made in the name of a nation that had never seen industrial war. The election campaign twisted overnight. The question was no longer just whether the country wanted Joseph Cook or Andrew Fisher. It was whether the country trusted either of them to steer Australia through a conflict no one yet understood. In a strange, almost surreal twist, his rival stepped up beside him in a way that blurred the usual lines. Fisher, the labor leader, did not call for retreat or caution. He went further. "Should the worst happen," Fisher said, "Australia will stand behind the mother country to the last man and the last shilling." The words sliced through the country. Two former miners, two self-made men, both now pledging the nation's blood and treasure for a war on the other side of the world. The rivalry that had defined domestic politics suddenly seemed both petty and terrifyingly magnified. The clock on the election did not stop for war. Cook traveled the country under new, harsher rules. Every speech now existed in the shadow of casualty lists that had not yet begun, but were already inevitable. He spoke about loyalty, about responsibility, about the need for a government that understood discipline in a time of crisis. Fisher spoke about solidarity, about caring for the families of the men who would go, about a labor movement that would not only fight the war, but protect those left behind. Behind Cook's measured sentences, behind his carefully balanced budgets and warnings about overspending, lay a darker calculation. Could a prime minister who preached restraint win the trust of a nation whose sons were about to be thrown into unimaginable danger? When the votes were counted, the answer was brutal. Joseph Cook lost. The one-seat majority that had lifted him to the highest office vanished. Labor, under Fisher, swept back into power with a solid majority. The double dissolution that was supposed to free Cook's government from the Senate's grip instead wiped it from the map. In the space of a year, he had climbed to the summit and tumbled off. For a man who had clawed his way out of a pit village, this was not his first fall. But sitting once more on the opposition benches, watching Andrew Fisher take the oaths of office, the sting was like nothing he had felt before. He had been prime minister during the first days of the war, had made decisions that would send young Australians to distant battlefields. Now he would not shape the war. He would question, criticize, demand answers from those who did. The rivalry with Fisher had taken on a new, cruel twist. The man who had accepted the party pledge Joseph had rejected, the man who had stayed loyal where Joe had rebelled, now had control, not just of domestic policy, but of the war effort. The sermon the labor movement could preach was painfully simple. Loyalty had been rewarded. Rats like Cook had been punished. Yet even in defeat, the work did not stop. From opposition, Cook threw himself into war measures with the same grim focus he had once brought to working a face underground. He might not agree with labor's approach to spending or industrial relations, but he would not sabotage a war effort that sent sons of miners and farmers and shopkeepers into battle. The reports began to arrive. First, glowing stories of young Australians in training camps in Egypt, marching under a blazing sun. Then, darker notes. Gallipoli. Trenches carved into cliffs. Bodies in the water, on the sand, on the steep slopes where a new nation's legend was being born and bled dry at the same time. Cook read the casualty lists with a jaw so tight it ached. Thousands wounded, thousands dead. Names from suburbs and towns he had visited. Whole streets emptied of young men. All his life, he had measured risk in terms of rockfalls and explosions that could kill a dozen men at once. Now he faced a war where a single day could erase a small town. Amid the carnage, the political landscape shifted again. Andrew Fisher, worn down by the strain of war leadership and internal labor quarrels, resigned as prime minister in 1915. He left for London as High Commissioner, ironically taking the kind of imperial role Cook's critics had always imagined he would seek for himself. In his place came another labor leader, William Morris Hughes. Hughes was everything Cook was not. Volcanic, theatrical, tireless in public, a man whose voice could fill a hall and whose temper could scorch a room. He had risen through labor's ranks as a fierce defender of the movement that had turned its back on Cook, yet his mind, like Cook's, ran on hard numbers, on the cold arithmetic of ships and shells and men. The new prime minister admired Cook's discipline, even as they clashed across the chamber. And as the war dragged on, as casualties mounted and the volunteer queues shrank, Hughes found himself at the edge of a decision that would shatter his own party as thoroughly as labor had once shattered Joseph Cook. Conscription. Could Australia force men to go to war? Hughes believed it had to. The voluntary system was faltering. The British were calling for more troops. The Empire's expectations pressed on him like the weight of a collapsing roof. But labor's base, that disciplined movement that had expelled Cook for refusing to bow to its will, was deeply divided. When Hughes called a referendum in 1916 to ask the nation whether it would support compulsory military service, he looked across the chamber and saw in Cook not just an opponent, but a potential ally. For Joseph Cook, the question ripped across old loyalties. He had never been a man to send others into danger lightly. He knew what it meant to face death at the end of a shift. But he also saw the cold reality of the war's demands. If Australia wanted a say at the peace table, if it wanted to be seen as more than a distant outpost, it could not simply drift along, on the courage of volunteers until the stream dried up. He made his choice. He would support conscription. He campaigned for it with the same calm, insistent arguments he had used all his life: duty, responsibility, the need to carry one's share of the burden. In town halls lit by bare bulbs, he stood alongside the man who had taken Fisher's place, the fiery Labour Prime Minister who now risked his own party's wrath. It was a shocking image for many Australians. Joseph Cook, the former Labour miner turned Liberal leader, and Billy Hughes, the Labour firebrand, arguing on the same side. The referendum split the country. Families argued at kitchen tables. Unions split. Churches thundered for and against. Posters screamed in bold black type. In some neighborhoods, conscription meetings ended in fistfights. On polling day, the whole nation became a jury on a question that could not be answered without tearing someone's world apart. The result was a knife to Hughes and a bitter, familiar cut to Cook. Conscription was defeated. Hughes returned to Parliament to find his own party turning on him. For his enemies within Labour, the story wrote itself. He had sided with conservatives, with the same forces that had once embraced Joseph Cook. He had betrayed the movement's heart. In 1916, as the party caucus moved against him, Hughes made the choice that would redraw the map of Australian politics. He walked out. With him went a group of Labour MPs who became the nucleus of a new force, the National Labour Party. Across the aisle, Joseph Cook watched as the party that had once expelled him now cracked along the same fault line of conscience versus discipline. It was the twist no one in the union halls of Lithgow or the caucus rooms of Sydney could have predicted. The Labour Prime Minister turned rebel and the long demonized rat from the mines stepping forward as an ally. Cook and Hughes joined forces. Their followers merged with Cook's Liberal Party to form a new political machine, the Nationalist Party. In 1917, they went to the country asking Australians to endorse this unlikely coalition. The disciplined Liberal organizer and the volcanic ex-Labour firebrand, united by the war and by a belief that the old party lines no longer matched the brutal demands of the time. The election delivered what Joseph Cook had failed to secure in 1913, a commanding majority. Hughes stayed Prime Minister. Cook, swallowing whatever personal pride might have whispered that he had once held that office himself, accepted a role that was, in some ways, even more grueling. He became one of the core architects of the war effort from within Hughes's cabinet, taking on the Navy, then the nation's finances, as his portfolios. If his earlier stint as Prime Minister had felt like standing at the edge of a cracking roof, this felt like working in the heart of the mine, while the war thundered overhead. Day after day, he dealt in numbers that no miner's son was ever supposed to comprehend. Ship tonnage, shell production, hospital beds, pensions, loans taken in London, with interest rates that would echo through Australian budgets for years. He had to find money for rifles and for widows' allowances, for warships and for artificial limbs. Every figure on his page represented either a weapon in a soldier's hand or food on a child's table. He had once worried about the cost of coal carts. Now he signed off on expenditures that could have bought and sold his entire boyhood village 100 times over. Outside cabinet, the country seethed. The second conscription referendum in 1917, pushed by Hughes despite the first defeat, failed again, deepening wounds that would take decades to heal. Working-class suburbs turned on Hughes. Many had long ago turned on Cook. Strikes flared. Accusations of betrayal flew in every direction. For some, Cook was still the original sinner, the miner who had abandoned Labour. For others, he was now part of a government they saw as prepared to sacrifice ordinary men for imperial glory. Yet amid the fury, amid the marches and the funerals and the bitter editorials, something else was taking shape. Australia was learning to think of itself as a nation that could act, decide, and speak in its own right. And Joseph Cook, the boy who once thought the world ended at the shaft head, found himself preparing for a journey that would prove it. In 1919, when the guns had finally fallen silent and Europe lay in ruins, the victors gathered in Paris to draw the new map of the world and write the terms of peace. For the first time, Australia would not simply be represented by a British delegate, it would speak with its own voice. Billy Hughes led the delegation, but standing beside him, in the glittering, haunted halls of Versailles, was Joseph Cook. The coal miner's son walked through rooms where chandeliers blazed and marble floors reflected the somber faces of men carving up empires. The air smelled of cigar smoke and old polish, but beneath it all he sensed something else, the ghosts of millions. On the tables before them lay treaties, draft clauses, lines that would determine mandates, reparations, borders. Somewhere behind those lines lay the future of soldiers who wanted to know whether their sacrifice had meant anything, of widows who wanted to believe their husbands had not died for a lie. Hughes thundered and blustered, demanding that Australia's voice be heard, resisting any suggestion that the Dominions were merely appendages of Britain. Cook, quieter, worked in the back rooms and committees, sifting through the economic and legal tangles, helping to shape positions. That balanced loyalty to the empire with the dawning realization that Australia's interests were not always identical to London's. It was there, in those rooms, that he saw something that would echo in his mind long after he left politics. The old order, once so solid, was far less stable than the mines he had mined. Empires cracked like coal seams, monarchies toppled. New countries appeared on maps drawn by men who had never set foot on their soil. And yet this tiny young commonwealth, with its 5 million people and its cemeteries scattered across Gallipoli, the Western Front, and the Middle East, sat at the table, not as a child, as a participant. When the Treaty of Versailles was finally signed, when Australia's signature went on the document under its own name, not merely as a line under British Empire, Joseph Cook felt a jolt that was part pride, part dread. Pride, because the journey from Silverdale to Versailles was almost unimaginable. Dread, because he knew that what had been signed in ink could one day be paid for again in blood. He returned home to a country that was exhausted, wounded, and impatient. The war was over, but the bills were not. The men who had limped home with missing limbs and shattered nerves wanted jobs, land, dignity. The families of those who had not come home wanted answers and support. The economy lurched as war industries wound down. The old class tensions, buried under the weight of the conflict, resurfaced with fresh bitterness. In cabinet meetings, Cook moved from war budgets to reconstruction plans. He worked on schemes to settle returned soldiers on the land, to manage the crushing debt, to keep the fragile machinery of the young Commonwealth from seizing up under the strain. He had reached a different kind of summit now, not the brief, precarious pinnacle of the Prime Minister's office, but a long, grinding plateau of responsibility where every decision either eased a burden or shifted it onto someone else's back. In the evenings, when the files were closed and the offices darkened, he sometimes found his mind drifting back to a cramped kitchen. In Lithgow, to the night he had refused to sign a pledge, so much had followed from that single act of defiance. Hatred, exile, reinvention, rivalry, war, Versailles. He had once believed that the choice was between being a man of conscience and a man of power. Now, deep into the third act of his public life, with his name etched into the laws and treaties of a nation still finding itself, Joseph Cook understood something harsher. Sometimes, to keep your conscience, you had to learn to live with the knowledge that, no matter how hard you worked, the clock would always outrun you. By the time Joseph Cook left the cabinet table and stepped away from the daily machinery of power, the clock that had once ticked so loudly in his prime minister's office had changed its sound. It no longer measured elections or the lifespan of a fragile majority. It measured him, his body, his remaining chances. The shrinking stretch of years in which he could still shape the country he had helped drag into the modern world. He was in his late 50s now, hair thinning, shoulders still straight but carrying an invisible weight that no war pension could account for. Across the chamber, the man who dominated the age, Billy Hughes, still crackled with manic energy, shouting, gesturing, bullying the air itself into submission. Newspapers chased Hughes's every phrase, every feud, every outrageous gesture. Cook watched, the quiet architect beside the volcanic showman, and understood a cruel truth that had stalked him since the mines. You could win the fight and still lose the story. After Versailles, the glow of victory never really warmed Australia. Demobilized soldiers returned to a country that did not match the promises printed on recruiting posters. There were welcome home parades, yes, and bands and speeches. But behind the brass and bunting came questions that no government could dodge for long. Where are the jobs? Where is the land you promised? Why do the men who never wore a uniform grow richer while those who went to the front hobble down George Street on crutches? As treasurer and then as one of Hughes's most trusted ministers, Cook found himself trying to stretch every pound until it almost screamed. He knew the arithmetic as intimately as he had once known the feel of rock under a miner's boot. War loans taken in London, pensions for widows and maimed veterans, railways, telegraphs, ports, quarantine stations. He argued for sound budgets, for discipline, for avoiding the kind of reckless spending that could cripple a young nation for generations. It was the same sermon he had preached in Union halls years before. Hard choices now, steadier ground later. But the mood of the country was changing. The war had expanded expectations. Men who had faced machine guns were not inclined to accept lectures about patience from men in suits. Industrial unrest flared. Strikes spread through the waterfront, the coal fields, the workshops. For some, Hughes was still a hero. For others, he had become an arrogant tyrant. And in the background, always, there was Joseph Cook, hands on the levers of finance, trying to rein in a government led by a man who despised the word no. Behind closed doors, the rivalry between the two men sharpened. Hughes wanted to spend, to promise, to push. He lived from crisis to crisis, thriving on them like a man addicted. Cook wanted structure, prudence, a path through the turmoil that did not end in exhausting the nation's credit or its patience. They had stood side by side in the conscription campaigns, endured the same abuse in angry town halls, watched the same referendum defeats crash over them. But the alliance that had forged the Nationalist Party was never a friendship. It was a temporary truce between two different kinds of ambition. Hughes's ambition was for the spotlight. Cook's was for the ledger, the lasting shape of institutions and accounts that would outlive all of them. By 1920, it was clear that the partnership could not last forever. Hughes's public battles with unions, his fierce loyalty to imperial causes, his habit of making enemies faster than he could count, them gradually wore down his support. Within the nationalist ranks, new figures emerged, lawyers, businessmen, younger men who had not come from the pits or the docks, who spoke in the polished tones of boardrooms rather than workshop floors. They looked at Hughes and saw a fading thunderstorm. They looked at Cook and saw something else, a bridge to an older, rougher generation, but also a man whose time, like his hair, was thinning. The party needed a new face, a newer kind of politician, someone more palatable to the rising middle classes, to the chambers of commerce and the professional associations that would define the next phase of Australia's growth. The irony was sharp enough to cut coal. The man who had once been cast out of labor as a rat, the rebel who had broken with his comrades over a pledge, now looked like the conservative anchor of a ship preparing to change direction again. Cook could read the signs. He had spent his life watching small signals, tiny shifts in rock, faint tremors in the ground that warned of a collapse. He could feel the same tremors in politics. There was, he knew, one more great task he might still perform for Australia. One more place where his experience, his caution, his tenacity could matter. And then He would have to get out of the way. The offer came in 1921. The government wanted him to go to London as Australia's High Commissioner. On paper, it was a promotion, a senior, prestigious post at the heart of the British Empire, representing Australian interests, too. The government in Whitehall, sitting in on imperial conferences, shaping naval strategy and migration schemes and trade deals. In reality, it was also a release valve. Hughes would be free to dominate the domestic stage without the quiet counterweight of Cook's caution at his elbow. And Cook, instead of fading slowly on the backbench, would take on a final, enormous task in a city that had haunted his imagination since childhood. He did not hesitate long. He had seen what London could do from afar, how it sent ships and orders and money and expectations across the world. Now, for the first time, he would stand in the rooms where those orders were written. For a miner's son who had once thought the shaft head was the edge of the world, it was a chance to step right into the engine room of the empire. There was a countdown embedded in the decision. He was 60. Long sea voyages were no longer an adventure. They were a test. The High Commissioner's term was not endless. He would have only a handful of years before age and distance combined to pull him home, whether he felt finished or not. And in those years, the shape of the empire itself was on the table. So he went. The journey to London was almost surreal. Instead of cramming into a steerage bunk like the young Joseph Cook who had crossed oceans seeking a new life, he traveled as a senior, representative of a sovereign dominion. He stood on deck in a decent suit, not a miner's work clothes, and watched the shoreline recede, thinking not of escape, but of responsibility. They docked in a metropolis that made Sydney look like a provincial town. London's streets were still scarred by war, men with empty sleeves and hollow eyes, food shortages, coal lines. But the city remained the imperial capital, the hub through which energy and authority flowed. The Australian offices in London were a mixture of bureaucracy and ambition. Files on wheat shipments and migrant quotas sat beside folders marked with heavier subjects: naval defense, war graves, imperial preference, tariffs, the terms on which Australia could claim a voice equal to older, richer dominions like Canada. Cook threw himself into it with the same stubborn focus he had once brought to learning shorthand by candlelight. His days filled with meetings, civil servants with clipped accents, admiralty officials fretting over Pacific routes, bankers talking about loan renewals, private interviews with colonial officemen who still, occasionally, slipped and called Australia a colony. He corrected them politely. He had not watched Australians die at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, only to hear their country reduced to a subordinate again. Yet the most searing experiences lay not in official rooms, but in the fields of France and Belgium. As High Commissioner, Cook visited the war cemeteries where thousands of Australian dead lay under pale headstones in foreign soil. He walked along row after row of identical stones, each name a life uprooted from some street in Melbourne or Adelaide or Outback, town whose dust he could almost taste. Here lay the men whose sacrifice he had helped pledge when he stood beside Hughes and Fisher in wartime. Here lay the answer to anyone who still thought of Australia as a mere extension of someone else's power. The wind moved through the cemetery trees with the same low sigh he remembered from the mines, when air slipped through narrow tunnels. In those fields, the rivalry that had once consumed him felt briefly small. But politics, like a mine, does not stay quiet for long. In London, Cook found a new kind of adversary. Not a single rival, but a system. Old imperial hands who did not intend to give the dominions too much autonomy. British industries that wanted preferential treatment without offering much in return. Committees that assumed the overseas representatives would nod politely and accept whatever terms were placed before them. He did not shout, as Hughes might have done. He worked steadily, patiently, grinding away at resistance with facts, with figures, with quiet reminders of what Australia had paid in blood and money. The irony would have amused a younger version of himself. Once, He had been the man accused of betraying a movement because he refused to sign a pledge to obey party caucus. Now he was the one reminding Whitehall that Australia was not simply a line on someone else's balance sheet. The imperial conferences of the 1920s were slow battles fought in rooms heavy with cigar smoke and compromise. Representatives from Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and Ireland came, each with their own scars and demands. The British Prime Minister sat at the head of the table, but the tone had shifted since pre-war days. The Dominions now insisted on being consulted, not instructed. Cook, seated a little way down, weighed every word. He argued for recognition of Australia's right to manage its own foreign policy, to shape its own defense, to control its own trade. He did not seek to sever ties. His loyalty to Britain was deep and instinctive, but he believed that loyalty had to run both ways. Time pressed on him. He could feel it in his bones, in the ache in his hands during long sessions, in the strain of late-night reading under London's dim lamps. He knew that his term as High Commissioner would not last forever. Another man, perhaps a younger, smoother figure from the new Australian elite, would eventually sit in his chair. He wanted certain things nailed down before that happened. Not in the fevered language of manifestos, but in the dry, stubborn detail of agreements and understandings, recognition that Australia could sign treaties in its own name, consultation before imperial commitments, fair terms for trade. In corridors after conference sessions, he would catch glimpses of Hughes, visiting London, still buzzing, still storming. The old ally and rival had not lost his taste for outrage. Reporters clustered around Hughes, cartoons skewered him, British hosts alternated between amusement and exasperation. Cook saw, in those moments, the forked path they had chosen years earlier. Hughes's method, blaze so brightly that you could not be ignored. Cook's, hammer away at the foundations until the structure, almost without noticing, shifted. Australia's growing autonomy in the 1920s owed something to both men. Hughes would thunder in the main hall. Cook would follow in the committee room, making sure the thunder left fingerprints on paper. When honors came, they came in the language of the empire. He was knighted, elevated, given titles that his childhood self would barely have understood. Sir Joseph Cook, GCM, Privy Councillor, sounded like a character from a world his father would have heard about only from the pulpit, if at all. Sometimes, dressing for official dinners in the tailored clothes of a senior imperial representative, he caught sight of himself in a mirror and saw, for a moment, the boy in corduroy, covered in coal dust, looking back with wary eyes. Had he betrayed that boy? Had he betrayed the other young men from the pits, the ones who never escaped, who had cursed his name when he walked away from the labor pledge? Or had he taken their anger, their hunger, their thwarted lives, and smuggled them into rooms they would never see, using the language of budgets and treaties instead of strikes? He never answered the question out loud. But in the quiet of the High Commissioner's residence, far from both the Australian sun and the Staffordshire smoke, it hovered in the air. By 1927, the strain and the years had done their work. A new generation was in command back home. New parties, new combinations, new slogans. The capital itself was shifting, from Melbourne's known streets to the carefully planned avenues of Canberra. A different Australia was emerging. More urban, more mechanized, more distant from the memories of pickaxes and pit ponies. Cook handed in his resignation and prepared to sail home. There was no dramatic fall this time, no election night humiliation, no caucus ambush, just a measured end to a long, improbable tour of duty. He had begun as a Union firebrand and become, in the eyes of the Empire, a dependable statesman. The newspapers reported his return. Some of them mentioned his role at Versailles, his term as Prime Minister, his years as High Commissioner. Some, inevitably, could not resist reminding readers of the old rat epithet, as if the original sin could never quite be forgiven. But for ordinary Australians, living through their own struggles in the late 1920s, he was already half legend, half stranger. Young men in the street knew the names of sporting heroes better than that of a former prime minister who had retired before they reached voting age. He settled with his wife, Mary, Minnie, the girl he had married back when he was just another hopeful migrant in Lithgow, into a quieter life. They had raised a large family together, weathered poverty, political storms, war. Now, in a house far from the shafts and the house, they watched grandchildren play, listened to the radio instead of parliamentary debates, read the newspapers without seeing Joseph's name on every second page. Yet even in retirement, the clock did not fall silent. In 1939, when another war broke across Europe, a conflict even more expansive and murderous than the one he had helped steer Australia into, Cook felt the old dread rise in him with shocking speed. He was nearly 80. He could do nothing. He sat in an armchair while new leaders, some of them men who had grown up in a country shaped by his decisions, spoke into microphones, pledging support, promising sacrifice. Names like Menzies and Curtin filled the headlines now. Billy Hughes reappeared on the stage, still unkillable, still campaigning. Andrew Fisher was long gone, buried on the other side of the world. The rivalries of his youth and middle age had become footnotes in a larger story. The rise of a nation that, once again, was sending its sons to distant battlefields. This time, the casualty lists came by radio. He heard the names, the units, the theaters of war. North Africa, Greece, the Pacific. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent half a lifetime in public finance, that somewhere behind each broadcast lay columns of numbers. Ships built, shells fired, pensions calculated, debts contracted. He also knew something else, something too late to matter in the rooms where treaties were being signed in the 1940s. Versailles had not been the end of anything. It had been an intermission. He had sat at that table in 1919, watched the borders drawn, the reparations fixed, the punishments written into clauses. He had suspected, even then, that the terms were harsh enough to plant the seeds of another war. Now, as an old man in a quiet Australian street, he listened to the sound of bombers over London on the radio and wondered if, in some small way, his careful work at Versailles had helped build the path to this new catastrophe. You do not get to rewrite the past in old age. You only get to hold it, like a piece of coal, a hard black lump that stains your hands no matter how carefully you touch it. In the post-war years of the 1940s, fragile peace returned again. Australia emerged battered, but more confident, with a new sense of identity separate from Britain. The Statute of Westminster, which had begun as dry legal language about Dominion autonomy, suddenly felt real. The country had fought 2 world wars. It had signed its own treaties. It had begun to speak with its own voice. Few people walking past a modest house in Sydney where an aging Joseph Cook watched the light slant across the street would have connected that national stride with the decisions made by the quiet man behind the curtain, the votes cast in union halls, the refusal to sign a pledge, the budgets drafted, the cables sent from London, the lines argued over at Versailles. History, like politics, often remembers the loudest voices first. Hughes, with his snarling speeches and theatrical rebellions. Fisher, with his pledge and his legend as the faithful labor man. Their rivalry with Cook had defined decades of policy, split parties, created new ones. The Nationalist Party that Cook helped build from the wreckage of Labour's split would evolve, dissolve, and eventually give birth to the structures that still shape Australian politics. But memory is a ruthless censor. By the mid-1940s, when old colleagues died and obituaries began to appear, Cook found himself reading assessments of his own era that treated him as a secondary character in other men's dramas. It stung, but not as sharply as it would once have done. Time had taken away the urgency of his need to be recognized. What mattered, in the shrinking circle of his days, was whether the country his grandchildren would inherit was stronger, more stable, more capable of steering its own fate than the colony he had stepped into as a young miner with a second-hand Bible and a stubborn temper. On 30th July 1947, Joseph Cook's clock finally stopped. He died not in a mine collapse, not on a battlefield, not mid-speech in Parliament, but in ordinary circumstances at an ordinary age for a man who had survived 60 years beyond the life expectancy of many of his boyhood peers. Newspapers marked his passing with respectful columns. They called him a self-made man, a former prime minister, a dedicated public servant. Some mentioned his role in the conscription battles, his break with labor, his work at Versailles, his term as High Commissioner. A few revived the old debates, wondering whether his decision to support conscription had been courage or folly. For most Australians, the news was just one more item in a busy post-war week. The nation he had helped build was larger now, more complex, tangled in alliances and trade networks he could never have imagined as a boy. Its battles were different, its parties changed, its electorate broader. But if you listened closely to the structure of its budgets, to the stubborn insistence on both loyalty and independence in its foreign policy, to the strange, uneasy balance between labor and capital in its politics, you could still hear his footsteps. From the darkness of the Silverdale pit to the blinding halls of Versailles, from a shouted sermon in a union hall to a whispered argument in a London committee room, Joseph Cook had lived his life like a man working at the edge of a collapsing seam, holding up props while the roof shifted around him. He had never fully escaped his rivals. Fisher's shadow, Hughes's roar, the disciplined chorus of the labor movement he had defied. They had chased him through decades, through elections and referendums and war. But in the end, when the last vote was counted and the last speech forgotten, the real contest had not been between him and another man. It had been between a miner's son and the ticking clock, between the brief, limited span of a single human life and the slow, grinding forces that shape a nation. On that score, history would never deliver a simple verdict. It would only keep moving, layer after layer, like coal laid down in the dark. Each decision, each compromise, each moment of defiance, pressed into the bedrock of a country that, long after Joseph Cook's name faded from memory, still walked the path he had helped carve